Peter, I've looked at your website and at your LinkedIn, and one of the things that really struck me was how careful you are and how meticulous you are with your use of words in describing your organization, your mission, your values. And so I didn't feel that it would be fair for me to venture an introduction. Perhaps you could introduce yourself and your business, Praxis Lead Equity, and what you guys do and what your mission is.
Well, I appreciate that, Vic. I would submit to you that going right into this, words matter. And so, yes, I was very careful in trying to articulate what it is that my business, Praxis Lead Equity, does. I believe that one of the greatest challenges in today's business world, society in general, is disinformation or misinformation that doesn't do well enough to set the context into the conversations that we're having. So um, words really do matter. This is actually my third career. I started out as a very young man in the military, didn't intend for it to become a career, but ended up spending 25 years in the United States Navy and rose to some leadership positions uh, during Operation Iraqi Freedom and other exercises like that. So leadership is probably one of the primary foundations of my business. That's why I add lead. And then the second part is equity. My second career was as an educator. I started out as a teacher and then became an administrator, rose to the district level of K-12 education. So I'm a K-12 educator. And within that educational realm, I obviously use my leadership skills to be able to have a successful career in education. So that's the other part. I call it my inside out journey has brought me to in both the military and education has brought me to where I am today as the founder of Praxis Lead Equity. And it has been my life experience that equity is very, very important, but it's also very important to understand what equity is. People tend to confuse equality with equity. And
Hmm.
so part of what my business does is it goes into those nuances and it talks about those kinds of things that I think sometimes we tend to take for granted that everybody knows what that means. So Praxis Lead Equity is for leaders who want to implement a culture of inclusion and belonging within their business because data and research shows us that if you can build a business where people feel a sense of community, a sense of inclusion, then obviously they're going to help your business thrive. And so that's kind of it in the nutshell, how I came about to call it Praxis Lead Equity. One other component of the name of the business that I do want to touch on so you can get the holistic understanding of why Praxis Lead Equity. So Praxis is an actual word that I learned through my research of an educator by the name of Paulo Freire. Paulo Freire is where I first heard the word, and praxis it is an evolution, if you will, of critical thinking. So it deals with critical awareness or critical consciousness, critical reflection, critical analysis, and then finally, once all of those are working, then you can come up with some critical action. And so praxis is intentional activism, right? It's intentional in that it's not dynamic and it's complex. So when we're talking about relationships and we're talking about businesses, we all know it's not binary. It's very complex and dynamic. And so what I try to teach people is that you can be in education, you can be in a regular business, you can be in the military, you could be with a government agency, but you have to have this, what I call a fourfold approach of critical consciousness, critical reflection, critical analysis, and then critical action. And again, what we're looking for is eliminating any kind of barriers to success. And that's how, that process will help us hopefully identify what I call cultural blind spots that are hindering our success. And so that's why I developed the name of this particular business to include that framework. So that's kind of it in a nutshell. I don't know if you have any other follow-on questions to that, but there's so much more that goes to that too, because I use other frameworks as well, kind of bringing them all together to leverage success by creating an organizational culture that is inclusive, understands that yes, diversity is a strength, but that in that process, we have to unlearn some of the knowledge frameworks that we have either been brought up with or have experienced in our own lives.
Very interesting. Very interesting, Peter. And I'm assuming that, well, my experience in business has been that you can't help everybody. You can't help all of your prospective clients, which is almost the whole world, in an equal way. There are some segments of your market that can benefit more from your services than others, whether it's because they have the budget to do so or because they're just in a position to be receptive to what you teach. So my question is, who is your ideal customer? Who does Praxis Lead Equity help? Not necessarily who have you helped, let's say, but who is sort of the person or the organization that you're best able to help for whatever combination of reasons? Who's sort of your avatar, if you will?
I would say that the majority of the people that I've worked with are educators K through 12, but I've also worked with universities and colleges. Education, I think, would be a primary. I've since branched into also federal government. I've worked with National Institutes of Health. I've worked with other nonprofits too, as well. That seems to be coming on a little bit more now because they are, a lot of nonprofits work with communities. And so my concepts and this process works really well with helping them connect to the communities that they support. So I've worked with nonprofits and for-profit organizations that are looking for ways to improve what they deliver, also for ways this has kind of been a new something new that has surfaced, a way to retain people, because as we know, it costs a lot to train people, and that's why you want to retain them. And so my concepts, my principles, my approach works really well for retaining people so that you don't have to go out and hire new people. You keep the people you have, they develop the lens that will help your business, and then that way your business can continue to thrive. But I would say primarily education. I have spoken with groups like law enforcement, which I think would really benefit from this training. Military as well. If you look at what's going on in the world today, I think any organization that needs to understand the environment that we're operating in so that we don't get those, what I call again, cultural blind spots. For example, relative to the military, a path I want to go into is addressing the difference, for example, between nationalism and patriotism. It's a significant difference, but people tend to kind of think they're the same thing, and they really aren't. And I really believe that's what's causing a lot of the division in this country right now. And so even though there's been a little bit of a pushback to the kind of work that I do, because it is associated with diversity, equity, and inclusion, my goal and my passion, I haven't been discouraged because this is my passion, is to clarify what that means for people and to recognize that a lot of these terms are being misused and they're being used for disinformation, and the context of which they're used in today's society is to cause fear. Fear oftentimes out of ignorance, out of, like when you hear the word privilege, how somebody does, they become defensive about that, not recognizing that when I talk about privilege and entitlement, it's not something that you've earned, because we all earn what we get. But when I talk about privilege and entitlement, I talk about the kinds of things that you don't have to carry or you have to worry about. So as a man, for example, I have certain privilege and entitlement just because I'm a man as compared to a woman. And likewise, when we get into race and ethnicity, same thing. And so if there are things that I don't worry about on a daily basis, that's a privilege, where other groups of people have to worry about them. Now, I will tell you this as a real life example. I never used to worry about going out to the store, to a restaurant, and not having my ID. Well, I don't have that privilege anymore because of the immigration policies that are being enforced in this country right
Mm.
now. So the other day I was at a restaurant and I realized I didn't have my ID, and then it just occurred to me that now people are coming up to people that look like me, like you, and they're asking us for what is our citizenship. And so, you know, there are some groups of people that don't have to worry about being asked that. Okay. So, that's a privilege and unearned entitlement for some people. And that's what I mean by privilege and entitlement. And so that's why to me, words matter. We really do need to understand where we fit in the world. We need to understand that almost immediately when you and I met just now, you looked at me, I looked at you. Maybe there were some kind of assumptions that started to percolate within us, and so one of the big things that I say is having a culturally competent lens is not allowing those assumptions to enter into our interaction, but
Mm.
instead hold them in check till you and I have had the opportunity to interact, or as I like to say, have dialogue. And that's part of my process as well. It's called the RDA process. It's reflection, dialogue. And out of that reflection and dialogue, then I create the action moving forward as to how I need to proceed, all the while making sure that I don't cause what I call a microaggression, in meeting and talking with you. You've heard the term, you only get one chance to make a first impression. And so that's really important, I think, for business leaders to understand that, and that when they meet somebody, not to make assumptions or take for granted things that make us feel comfortable. There could be, different situations that make other people feel uncomfortable. And also knowing how to deal with that uncomfortableness for somebody and managing the dynamics of difference in a way that invites, not indicts. So you're meeting me for the first time. I want to have the kind of first impression with you that, hey, you know what? I just met Peter today and he was an inviting person. I want to learn, I want to know more. I want to learn more about him, see what he's all about. And in that way, your culturally competent lens can expand as well. And that's why I love what I do. What I do is passion. It really is. And people were asking me when our government came out and said, hey, anti-D, people were worried, well, what are you going to do now? What's going to happen to your work since the government is against it? And in my head, initially, I will be very honest, I was a little apprehensive, like, well, I don't know. But I'm doing this as part of my passion, part of what I believe. And so I'm going to keep doing it. And here was an epiphany for me. At some point, the country to survive is going to have to come back together. They're going to have people that have been divided or are on polar opposites are going to need to learn how to come together and have dialogue. Well, that's what I do. And so that goes back to the whole concept of I'm here to invite, not indict. And so one of the strategies that I help people learn is what I call breakthrough questions. So if, for example, I get a barrier question or a barrier comment, like if somebody says, why is it always about race? Then I have a breakthrough question to come back to that person so they have to answer their own question. And that puts them in touch with some of those things that are below the surface, right? And, the way I've answered that question, for example, is well, because some people's race and ethnicity is very real, it's constant, and other people don't think about it so much. And so, it's because it's reality, is what I say.
Wow. Very interesting. I had a lot of thoughts and feelings as you were saying that. And just a few sort of quick things I can add is when I encountered you, so when we hopped on the call, actually the first thing that entered my mind was, gosh, I hope when I get a bit older, I look as cool and dignified with the salt and pepper look, kind of like a
Thank you.
kind kind of like a very dignified look. And but that's one of the interesting things about having people on a podcast or running a podcast is you're going to meet all sorts of people from all walks of life. And something I was just talking about with my wife the other day is that like the master quality, I think, could be wrong, for interacting with people or even just going through life yourself is a sort of mindfulness, a meditativeness, which in practice, what that means is that whatever interaction is happening or whatever you may be thinking or feeling about people based on whatever assumptions or precepts you might hold or that your conditioning gives you is to sort of keep a distance from that and sort of observe that and try not to let that steer your conversation or take you off track from the fact that you're actually talking with somebody and your focus should be on being present with them and listening, trying to listen to what they say instead of like molding them to your ideas of who you think they are, even though they're showing you who they are in that moment. And it's an interesting thing because I've lived in Thailand for 15 years and I haven't been back to the US for many years, but I can see how the level of divisiveness and just extreme disharmony seems to be escalating more and more. And it's really not something that you see in Thailand, which is kind of nice to not have that sort of tension between people. There are other problems. There are problems everywhere in the world, of course, but I don't know, one less thing to sort of worry about. But it sounds like that's something that you are really passionate about, is engaging in that kind of dialogue. So I guess you're in the right place, so to speak. Peter, can we get into some of the services or products that you offer? I know you have a certification program. I'm curious, how do you actually, in practice, help these organizations or these individuals who you and your team work with?
Sure. And thank you for the compliment. And, that is something that we need to do is pay attention and listen. And something that I try to encourage people to do, it doesn't matter what you do, but if you present a curiosity about the people you encounter, you're going to make a good first impression. When I seen you, if I could kind of share kind of my reflection when I first met you as well, I was looking at you and I was like, well, here's a young man, WordPress, first thing that comes to mind, younger generation. So in my head, I start kind of trying to figure out, what generation you're from. You're obviously more in tune with social media. You're obviously more in tune with modalities of communication. And so, but I did notice that your ear reminds me of a friend of mine that was a wrestler. And so I don't want to make an assumption that, maybe you're a wrestler or a boxer, but that's kind of, I noticed, just in your ears. And so that is something that I've, since as I've started this business and I started kind of trying to pay attention, if you will, to people. And so we do a certification. It's cultural proficiency certification. It is based on the work of the Center for Culturally Proficient Educational Practice, otherwise known as CCPEP. And that organization was created by the founders, Doctors Dolores and Randy Lindsay, and there's a couple other authors on that. And that's the conceptual framework that I use in doing this work. And there's 4 tools, and it's basically done in 3 different components, 3 sections, if you will. 3 days of the introduction to the conceptual framework, 3 days for practical application of the framework. How do we actually put this framework and this theory into practice? And then 4 days of building an equity action plan, as well as teaching you facilitation and coaching skills on how to, for example, I mentioned it earlier, the breakthrough question,
Mm.
how to avoid getting stuck. Because as you can imagine, some of these conversations can be very sensitive. And so, that's what the 10-day certification program, that's how it's designed. And in today's situation where I did experience when COVID hit is how was I going to do this certification when it really does require personal interaction? And so I had to get creative with that in working through what I called a hybrid approach to this work. And so I did it. I've done it completely virtual. I've done it hybrid where when I do this training, which I use a co-facilitator model. So there's always 2 of us. And so, for example, I was working in a school district in California and my co-facilitator was virtual. And so I was there at a time when they had space requirements. So you can only have so many people in a room, and then you
Right.
had to have, right, all of that. You had to wear a mask,
Just
distancing. Yeah, exactly. And then so my co-facilitator did a lot of the facilitation virtual when everybody was, basically in the same room. But then when it came to kind of go through the strategies or the activities, then I would go and I would visit these different rooms, right, where we were maintaining that distancing and all that. And then at the very, at the beginning and at the end, we would do a large circle outdoors, and so I experienced that. And, I've worked with other organizations like the Museum of Tolerance, and I did some of this work with them virtually as well. And so, yeah, it's just been a learning curve for me, and the right modalities or the right software programs to be able to infuse to keep it engaging, and I've used different programs because before I used to just show the video from my computer, but that sometimes would come in skipping or whatever on somebody else's computer. So then we went to a different platform that allowed people to click on the video link on their own, and then they could watch the video without all the skipping and all that. And then, of course, things like Poll Everywhere, breakout rooms, all these other things. And then there was a component as well I've used, kind of do your own work, kind of research on your own time. So it'd be like visiting a virtual exhibit at the Museum of Tolerance, for example. So people could go on there and actually go to the museum, and then they could draw material from that that would actually support the curriculum that I was using for the certification process. So that's 10 days of that, 60 to 80 hours. And sometimes people don't have that much time to devote. So we've kind of transitioned now to separate those three parts. And so if you want to just get an introduction into what this is all about, it's 3 days. You get the introduction. And then out of that, if people want to go deeper, further, then we get into practice, right? The practitioner part, and then facilitator and coaching part.
so if somebody wanted to get certified, would they be able to do it in a self-paced environment, fully remote, or is there always a physical component at this point?
No, they can do it fully remote. As a matter of fact, that's where I want to eventually get to, is have that is a component I would like to implement into my business, is a fully remote 10-day certification, self-paced. And, they would have to complete the curriculum, and then me or one of my colleagues as my co-facilitator would check on the progress. So basically you would let's say you go through a virtual exhibit, you learn the concept, you're asked what I call reflective questions, you answer those, and then the facilitator responds to you. It's just kind of like what I went through, the virtual learning I went through when I was a teacher. It was actually from a college that was further away. So it was that kind of there's whether it's Canvas or some other, way to interact with your students, and then you leave messages, and then, you can also have students interact with other students where, like, you'll say, okay, you need to post your introduction here, and then I need you to introduce yourself to 2 or 3 other people, and then that's how you kind of try to build that engagement and that community in that way. But that's where I would love to get to that point where it is fully virtual, and maybe even the hybrid where maybe it's part, I will come to your organization, introduce myself in person, because I've learned that's really important, right?
Yeah.
Because that's that first real connection, right? Is you get there and there's a group of people in a room, you introduce yourself, they ask you questions, you're starting to build that relationship. And I like to think that I'm a very approachable person. And so then, that would then, I would say, okay, we will meet again at the end of the 10 days, or maybe at the midpoint at some point. But then that way, there's that connection.
Yeah, it's interesting because COVID really had a forcing function on a lot of businesses to evaluate the viability of actually their business model, because so many businesses depended on having a physical presence or a physical location or traveling to a particular place. And while that's a really important part of a lot of businesses, as you just pointed out, Peter, it's also it was kind of like the necessity is the mother of invention, where it just made people think, okay, well, how can we actually help more people and do so in a way that's also scalable, because business has to generate a profit. I mean, even nonprofits need to be profitable on the ledger in order to be able to help more people and to fulfill your mission. And so a lot of businesses went online and started using technologies like LearnDash and things like of that nature. So it's really good to see, because you can still do the physical certification, physical events, but from a business perspective, it really opens a lot of doors and allows you to potentially scale things up as well. However, I imagine in the case of the certification, because you're there and there's a co-facilitator, that maybe there are some limits to the scale that you're able to apply. I don't know if, growing to be huge is really your driving motivation, but certainly with some size comes the ability to have more influence and help more people. And so how do you negotiate the sort of scaling difficulties inherent in your particular business model?
I think us meeting today is a perfect example. I think, trying to get my message out, trying to, I recently stuck my toe, if you will, into the whole social media arena. And I had a young lady who, believe it or not, was a former student of mine who got her communications degree and then reconnected with me. And she became kind of like my social media person. And we did 8 or 10 videos, and it's incredible. Those 8 or 10 videos, I'm still getting, I get notifications that people have liked the video, they've reposted it. And so that's kind of what I see. And in reality, for me, I want to help society in general. I'm a humanitarian, and an arena I hadn't even thought about was outside of the United States. But somebody
Mm.
mentioned that to me at one point as well, that, there are many places that need somebody that can bring people together, that can work and solve problems and create a better planet, let's just say, create a better world. And as I've done this work, and as you can tell, I'm getting a little long in the tooth, so I probably have less time on Earth than I've gotten to at this point. But I sure would love just to leave my legacy as somebody that helped other people have what I call paradigm shifts. And so what I mean by that is, through this process of Praxis, what's interesting that even for myself, my ideology, my perspective, my knowledge frameworks, there have been paradigm shifts that I don't think the same way that I did growing up as a high schooler, a college person, or a military guy. And those paradigm shifts are what really make life, I think, worth living. So I used to maybe, for some things, have a deficit approach. Now I have an asset. That's kind of a paradigm shift I went through. When I would think of things like students that we would call at risk, I no longer call them at risk. I call them either at promise, or I call them underserved, meaning that the responsibility is not theirs because they're at risk. The responsibility is on us as educators, in that we have not served them well yet to make them
Mm.
lifelong learners and be successful. And so there's that shift of looking at them and instead look at us. If there isn't parent involvement, then we need to shift that to parent engagement. Parent engagement will create parent involvement. That's another paradigm shift that I had. Because trust is important, and in certain communities, you got to have that before you're going to get others involved. I found out that by getting parents engaged, a core group of parents, maybe 3 to 5 parents, I could have a lot of parents involved. And so those are the distinctions that I try to bring to create those paradigm shifts. And I would tell you that I can talk about this because I've done it. And so when people ask me, well, what makes you different than this other person over here that is doing the same thing or kind of the same thing as you're doing, I tell people all the time, well, what I talk about, I've done. And so I'm doing it from a practitioner's point of view, not theory or concept. And that's kind of the difference too between, let's say, me and some of my colleagues who are professors, right? They deal a lot in concept and theory, but they don't have that practitioner experience. And I've had that about 20 years of practitioner experience in education and about 25 years in the military. And where they crossed over for me during my generation was where when I joined the military, there were skills there were fewer opportunities for women. And then women started coming in, and we had to open doors for women in a very male dominated culture. And so that's my practitioner there. I've led that work. I've led those opening of doors. And so when I got into education and I realized there's certain groups of students that are doing better than other groups of students. And a lot of the times teachers would have a deficit view of certain groups. And so they'd basically be blaming these groups for their lack of success. And I've always told educators that my paradigm shift was, it's not about them, it's about us. So what can we do to shift that to say, it's about how are we eliminating the barriers to learning for students? And I come to find out that a lot of the barriers are really self-imposed blind spots. And I'll give you a quick story of what changed my mind about that. I was teaching in a town in California where the majority of the community was Spanish speaking. And I'm a Latino. And so a lot of those kids were Latino. And I had this idea, well, if I did it, you can do it too, right? Trying to transfer, my motivation to somebody else, that if I did it, it's kind of the whole meritocracy kind of way of
Mhm.
thinking. But then I had and young kid told me, he asked me in Spanish, so how can I do what you did? And I told him, well, you just got to work harder. You just got to pull yourself up by your bootstraps. And he goes, why do I have to work harder? And then he followed up with, and what if I don't have any boots? And so it got me thinking, right? And the boots that I had was that English was my first language. So I had that pair of boots. This young man, Spanish speaking student, was learning English. So he didn't have the same boots that I had or the same, access to education that I had. And so it shifted my thinking that, we have to change the system, not try to change people, but recognizing that we sometimes limit what we think people can do. And so we have a tendency to default to that. And so I tell people all the time, the system's not broken. The system is giving us the results it was created to give us. The system in education, especially public school education, has not been changed for years. And I would even go as far as to say it's not broken. It's given us the results it was designed to give us. And then we had a once in a lifetime 100-year COVID when COVID hit. And what was the one thing that everybody kept saying? I can't wait to get back to normal. And I would tell people, why do you want to rush to get back to normal when normal wasn't servicing all kids anyways? Why don't we instead reimagine education? And as we were talking just now about this whole virtual environment, why can't we still leverage this way of educating students? Because there were some students that did very well in the virtual environment.
Mm.
And I would submit to you that now, more so out of necessity, students use this modality to learn, whether we're going to be there to teach them or not. They're learning things, and that's where that whole disinformation and misinformation has me worried. And so, I think we miss opportunities because our thinking is not a growth mindset. It is a very structured mindset, and that it works against us, to say the least.
Peter, what I really resonated with what you just said was, or the thing I pulled out of it was this sense of extreme ownership from the perspective of the educator, or let's say the adults, or the people in charge or in positions of privilege, if you will. One of our clients is Echelon Front. That's Jocko Willink's leadership training company. Jocko is a former Navy SEAL. He's kind of popular with my generation. He's got a great podcast and whatnot. And he always talks about extreme ownership. And you mentioned going from a deficit way of thinking to an asset-based way of thinking, turning somebody, like in a military context, for example, you've got somebody who's just not pulling their weight, or they're just a little bit kind of not, they're dragging everybody down. Well, you kind of have two options. They're in the team, they're part of the team. So you can either help them and turn them from a liability into an asset, and you take that ownership and teach them and train them, or you can sort of blame them and, beat them with bars of soap or whatever the modality is. And those are really, it's quite binary. So if somebody's on the team, okay, not everybody belongs on the team. That's a separate issue. But let's say they're there, they're qualified. Okay, well, now how can we take this person from dragging us down or being a liability or potentially hurting the team, hurting the mission? And how can each individual take ownership to assist that person, to educate that person, to take them aside and show them something that maybe they're not naturally good at? So I really resonate with that. That absolutely translates to all areas of life and business. And, kind of starting to wrap this up, you mentioned that you're kind of exploring these other technologies. What challenges have you experienced in your business around, let's say, like using WordPress, using LearnDash, these different technologies? And what have you learned? What have you struggled with in that arena?
I think for me, it's catching up. It's knowing how they can help my business. If kind of use that example about the social media, I never gave it a whole lot of thought. And then this young lady showed me how to create a TikTok video. She gave me some questions. I answered them. She knew how to piece them together. She knew what what lanes to put it into, right? Kind of, she knows how the algorithms work. It's just that for me has been probably the biggest challenge is catching up to that. I got to tell you, every day I'm inspired with different things that I feel need to be addressed, right? And when I hear things that are disinformation or I hear things that are very narrowly structured, I want to respond to that. And if I could, I wish I had the ability to do, and I've noticed this too, like some of the people that used to be on the news, now they have their own Substack or they have their own podcast, and I think if I could do that and sustain my business, and again, my thing is just to continue doing what I'm doing and maintain my standard of living. And even though I've got two careers and I got my little retirement from both, still, I have to work. But if I could do it where I could just, as soon as I hear something that's hot off the press or on the airwaves, and I could just put something out there to respond to it right away
Mhm.
and say, you're being led down the wrong path. So here, I'll give you a good example. School choice, the whole argument about school choice, people don't realize that that only works for people that have the means, not for the most underserved. The people that are most underserved are still going to find it difficult to access the benefit of a school voucher, for example. And so I want to refute that. I want to especially inform communities that need somebody that speaks their language, that has practical experience, that is authentic and genuine about, this just popped into my head. I think it's real important. I used to think that my job was to get you to change your mind. And if you didn't change your mind and start thinking like me, I failed. I don't think that anymore. My job is to make you curious about why you think the way you do and have you do your own inside out work and be curious as to how you can change your mind. It's not my job to change your mind.
Mhm.
It's my job to make you curious by providing you a little bit of clarification. It's just like whether it's difference between nationalism and patriotism, the difference between race and ethnicity, the difference between race and citizenship, and the components of what creates a human being and all that intersectionality that goes with it. And we ain't even talked about gender identity or gender issues or any of that stuff. It's very complex. And it's really my thing is I want to make it so that your thinking is less binary and more dynamic. We
Mm.
tend to think about right and wrong, black or white. We want these clearly defined lines, but life and people aren't that way. And so you have to kind of have a more complex way of looking at things. And that's why I like the knowledge frameworks that I use with going back to critical thinking, critical reflection, critical analysis, critical action. And one thing that I do say relative to my business, and it's in my logo, is equity requires action. I could sit here and talk to you about equity all day long, but if you're not going to take what I'm sharing with you and put some action behind it, it's might as well not even call it equity. So that's kind of what floats my boat. That's kind of what fills my cup is when I talk to people and I get them curious and I hear something like, well, I never thought about it that way. I know I've done my job. And so it's not me so much convincing you to change your thinking. It's you changing your own thinking because all I did was make you curious.
Right. If you try to change my thinking, I'll just dig my heels in even more, probably. Right. So it's not only ineffective, but it's probably not as satisfying as helping ask questions and get people to evaluate their own beliefs and come to sort of more objective conclusions about things. That's great.
Absolutely.
And I feel your passion. I love doing these interviews with people who really care about what they're doing. And so I think that's a really great note to end on, to wrap up on. Thanks so much, Dr. Peter, for joining us, and talk to you next time.
Thank you, Vic. Have a great day.